couple minutes later, completely re-outfitted in a gingham housecoat and, I suspected, no bra.
"I'm going for comfort,"
she announced. I took the pitcher of iced tea from Dottie and poured 3 glasses, while she slathered mayo on a whole wheat bun. A couple minutes later, we each had a ham sandwich in front of us, and a bag of barbecue-flavored chips sat there, open for sharing.
"So, spill it,"
I said in Graham's favorite private eye manner. "What did we learn?"
"Well, the good news is that I don't seem to be a prime suspect for the stolen money anymore," Graham said.
"Weirdest thing, you ask me," Dottie added. "They ain't even asking questions. Don't seem all that worried." Graham nodded.
"It's true. I sort of got the feeling they're covering for Althea, the treasurer. She's a nice lady, and they really don't have anyone else to take over the job if she quits it. So I think nobody wants to bring up how she should have caught these shortages."
I could see that. When people are volunteering for a job, they can walk away. But the shop, that's not really Althea's responsibility, is it? Accounting for the cash in the business end of things was up to Carol, wasn't it? They both shrugged, sort of agreeing with me, sort of unsure. "Did you tell Reverend Marshall how much we think is missing?"
"Not really. Didn't seem the time or place,"
Graham said. She picked up the second half of her sandwich. For a senior, the lady still has a great appetite. "I might need to have the meeting with him myself," I said, musing as I helped myself to more chips. I looked up at Graham. "That is, if they want me to continue looking into this."
"Oh, I think they do. Well, not really that they want you to, but no one objected."
Talk about feeling needed. Maybe I should just drop it all. If they weren't concerned about the losses, why was I? The police didn't seem to think Benny's death was suspicious. The church didn't seem to think the missing money was anything to worry about. Maybe I truly was overreacting. Dottie read my expression, as she tends to do. "I say you stick with it. That bookkeeper lady, she ripped off the store. That's money could have gone to the poor."
"She's right. Once you tell Reverend Marshall how much we figured out is missing, I think he'll change his tune."
"You do got some proof it's that Carol, don't you?" "I think so." I hoped so. Which reminded me of the Christmas present waiting in my t-shirt drawer at home. I quickly finished my sandwich and excused myself, saying that the ladies ought to make time for a nap this afternoon. I was rummaging through our household toolbox, thinking a good heavy wrench would work to smash the lock on the gray metal box, when Drake walked in. "What's up?" He asked the question, but one glance told him what I was trying to accomplish. He picked up the biggest, toughest screwdriver in the set, placed the tip in the narrow space between the lid and box, and with one twist of the wrist he managed to pop it open. "Thanks. You're my hero." Guys love it when you say that, too. He gave me a kiss and walked back into the house, where he took up residence at his desk. I carried the box to the dining table, finding a spot where the light was good, before I opened the lid and really took a good look inside. It was filled with credit cards, passports, and driver's licenses. Holy cow! Like a kid with a new set of Legos, I dug into the treasure and began assembling identities. There were 4. One for the gray-haired man I thought I remembered from the time I'd seen Carol's husband pick her up. 3 separate sets for the woman I'd seen driving the caddy away from the post office. None of them used the surname Day. I had to pace the room twice, ignoring Freckles' plea to play ball with her, before it occurred to me that, if they were using the name Day now, they would have those documents with them. Everything in the box was backup. Or were one of these personalities from the box the real ones, and Day was the fake? And where was Carol? I went back and studied the faces of the females in the photos. The poses were unsmiling, serious, sharper cheekbones and sculpted jawline, short hair in some, a bit longer in others, but none the color Carol wore hers. Of course, hair color was the easiest thing to change, nearly as quick as picking out a new outfit, so I couldn't judge by that. Eyes and noses didn't change much. I studied those. But truthfully, I had to admit that I hadn't exactly been around Carol enough to memorize her features. I couldn't even tell you what color her eyes were. The woman in the various photos looked enough like Carol to be related, but was it the same person? I couldn't say. I wished I had a photo of the thrift shop bookkeeper. It would be easier to compare with these. I tossed the driver's licenses onto the table, frustrated. Chapter 37. Was the traffic in Denver always this terrible? Rodney wondered as he steered for his life on I-25, hoping to get to their exit with themselves and the Cadillac intact. More than once he found himself cursing the old luxury car. Back in its day, a car hadn't been expected to maintain 80 miles an hour all day long. Well, a human wasn't meant to do that in Rodney's day either, and he realized how weary he felt. Aside from the traffic and speed, the big car was like a dinosaur running with gazelles, as other cars zipped around and in front of him. He felt as though the pink monstrosity was the biggest, most obvious thing on the road, the easier to catch you with, my dear. But Pinky was Cece's darling. She told him she had bought it cash money from the first successful job she pulled, several years before she met him. He knew that he dare not suggest they trade it for something more practical. For now, the plan was to spend a couple of days in Denver, making the rounds of some post offices where they had express mailed boxes of cash to themselves. It felt safer to have the cash with them now that they were out of New Mexico, but he'd begun to question that decision too. Maybe his nervous stomach would settle once they had put more miles behind them. "Do we have more of those Tums?" he asked. Cece reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a large bottle that was nearly empty. "Take these. We'll get more when we stop where there's a drugstore." He chewed the tablets, wishing he had something to drink them down with. But that was another thing about the old car. Without built-in drink holders, he'd spilled more than one soda, and his wife had made it a rule. No beverages in the car. He gritted his teeth and swallowed the dry tablets, along with the words that would have ruined the harmony with Cece. He squinted at the green overhead signs, watching for the exit they needed. What should have been less than a 6-hour drive was coming up on 8 hours. His stomach clenched again, and his head was beginning to throb. "This is it," Cece said. 1 mile ahead. This exit takes us to the Cherry Creek post office, the first of our stops." She looked over at him, noticing his pained expression. "We'll be there soon, honey. I can drive if you like." "No way to pull over at this moment." He knew his tone sounded abrupt, but did she not see what was going on all around them? She retreated into her corner and let him negotiate the exit. At the red traffic light, he asked her which way he should turn. The rest of the way she answered in monosyllables. When he spotted the familiar U.S. Postal Service sign ahead, he turned in. It was 5 minutes to closing time. Without a word, Cece got out of the car and raced toward the front door. Rodney sank down in his seat and closed his eyes, resting his aching neck against the seat back, rubbing his stomach with both hands. An image came to him. One time when he and 2 of his former gang had narrowly escaped a dogged Pinkerton man in London. They'd packed up in the middle of the night and run through narrow alleys and wynds, their knapsacks and valises awkwardly flopping about and bumping their legs. They'd caught the night bus to the far end of the line, stolen a car from a parking lot, and driven halfway to Wales before stopping. And they laughed about it, treated it as a lark. For Cece's sake, he needed to do that now, to rediscover the joy of the getaway rather than stressing over it. He chewed the last 2 antacids from the bottle and looked up to see his beautiful wife returning, 2 very familiar-looking boxes in her hands. "Got 'em, no problem," she said, her face alight. She set the boxes into the back seat. "About earlier." "I know. You're exhausted, honey. Let's go to the hotel I've picked out and have a nice dinner. You'll feel better in the morning. I'll drive." He switched seats and took her up on the offer. Chapter 38. The sets of identification sat in their neat little piles on my dining table, awaiting action on my part. So I started my search the way anyone does nowadays. Google. The name on the man's driver's license was Robert O'Flannery, which unfortunately was common enough that the search returned quite a few matches. It didn't take long to eliminate the former U.S. congressman, a car dealer in Las Vegas, and the CEO of Flannery Optometrics Incorporated. I was less certain about the bit-part actor whose IMDb profile showed an older man with gray hair in a style similar to what I remembered seeing. The face on the driver's license wasn't a great match, even though I reminded myself that actors have all sorts of ways to change their appearance and create alternate personalities. I left that search tab open so I could come back to it. 2 pages into the Google results, I found a news story which included a Robert O'Flannery who had been arrested in New York on suspicion of robbing a bank. The article came from the historical archives of a newspaper which, I discovered, no longer existed. I read through the 60-year-old story, fascinated with names like Billy the Buzz Stoner, Mad Mike Mulligan, and Fingers LaTruck, who were all named as co-conspirators. Robert Robbie O'Flannery had been the youngest of the group, charged with aiding and abetting the getaway of the others who had gotten into the bank's safe through a meticulously dug tunnel in a disused section of the subway line. The 2 men actually caught with the money in their possession did prison time, but young Robbie didn't seem to have suffered any consequences. The story made for fascinating reading, but I couldn't see how, other than the idea that once a crook, always a crook, this Robert Flannery could be the gray-haired man on the driver's license I'd found. I started searching the various female identities and found a lot of the same thing. The names were common enough that I had to weed through a lot of useless chaff before finding possible matches. 20 minutes into it, I had a big head-slap moment. All the identities used the same initials, the same as Carol Meyerson, the same as C.M. Day, the registered owner of the Cadillac. The realization did not exactly provide a way to get Carol arrested for stealing from heavenly treasures, but the pattern might provide the police with enough to build a case. I quickly discovered that I got better results by tacking on the word arrest after each of the names. Carla Matthews, nothing showed her on the wrong side of the law. Kathy Marks, nothing. Chris Manley, the same. But Carolyn Malone's name appeared in a news article 5 years ago in Houston. A pawn shop owner had reported the theft of a large amount of cash and most of the high-end jewelry from his stock. Carolyn Malone, the day shift clerk, had not shown up for work the next day. Suspicion immediately fell on Malone, but she had simply vanished. The address she'd provided proved to be a vacant lot. The phone number went to a Chinese restaurant. The only thing the pawnbroker could remember that was distinctive about her was that she drove a pink Cadillac. I read the article several times. It always came back to the pink car. But how had law enforcement missed such a distinctive vehicle? I was turning all the details over in my head when my phone rang.
Charlie, it's Paul Marshall from the church. I had a call from Elsa Higgins, and she said you've been wanting to talk to me?
My mind had to do an abrupt gear shift to catch up and remember what Graham and I had talked about at lunch. Yes, it's about the missing money from the thrift shop.
I'm available at 8 tonight if you'd like to stop by the church. I host a men's prayer group until then, and I usually hang around a bit longer in case any of them want to talk.
Sure, I can be there. For the first time in hours, I actually looked out the window and noticed the sun was low in the sky. My internet searches were not exactly productive right now, or I just wasn't processing what I was reading. Anyway, it was time for some fresh air. I put on a light jacket and picked up the dog's leash, and Freckles came running.
"Shall I warm up some soup for dinner?"
Drake called from his desk. Sounds great. I clipped on the leash and got dragged down the porch steps and across the front yard. It was practically a sprint down to our little neighborhood park, but the exercise and fresh air did both me and the pup some good. She made the rounds of the park, sniffing out all the other visitors of the day, and I circled the perimeter at a brisk pace, clearing my head and thinking of the information I wanted to pass along to Marshall at our meeting. Back at home, 20 minutes later, the aroma of soup filled the house, even though it was only leftovers that I had stuck in the freezer 2 weeks ago. While we ate our taco soup and tortilla chips at the kitchen table, Drake talked about the intricacies of calculating his flight fees for a job he was planning to bid on. Something about stringing some power lines to a tiny remote community in northern Arizona. I have to admit that I probably only heard half of it and absorbed even less. My head was still into the countless facts and data I'd been trying to absorb for the past week. I offered to do the dishes when we finished. Hey, how difficult is it to put 2 bowls and 2 spoons into the dishwasher? He went back to his calculations, since his bid was due before midnight tonight. I tidied the kitchen and gathered the notes I'd made about the missing money at the thrift shop, based on the folders I'd so conveniently swiped from Carol Meyerson's desk. And I still had a few minutes to waste before I needed to drive over to the church. My laptop and the little metal box with all the identification documents still waited on our dining room table, so I sat down and opened the lid on my computer. By default, up came a page of news headlines. Theater Guild meets $2 million fundraising goal. Would not normally have caught my attention, except the story from the Albuquerque Journal website included a familiar face. A smiling man was holding one of those giant, oversized cardboard replicas of a check, and the woman receiving it was none other than the lady I'd seen driving away in the caddy. She seemed to be fumbling with a wide-brimmed hat, but I recognized her short blonde haircut and the high cheekbones. She was identified as C.C. Day, and the story went on to say that she and her husband, Rodney Day, would be matching the $1 million raised by the Theater Guild for a total of $2 million, which would go to the refurbishment of the venue and upgrading the sound system. So the owner of the car, C.M. Day, was this C.C. According to the background details, the Days were supposedly multimillionaire philanthropists who had recently moved to New Mexico from Arizona and were thrilled to be able to help such worthy causes, yada, yada, yada. I was about to type in this additional search criteria, but my gaze dropped to the clock in the lower corner of my screen, and I realized I had only a few minutes to make my 8 p.m. meeting. Freckles seemed horribly disappointed when I told her she couldn't come, but she'd get over it. Drake would, no doubt, be handing out treats before my car was hardly out of the driveway. I picked up my notes and headed out. I'd attended church with Elsa a number of times as a child, so I knew exactly where I was going. But, full confession here, I'd not been back in years. With the passage of time and my own shifting perceptions, the place looked somewhat different. Trees in the neighborhood were larger, and what had once seemed like a vast parking lot really wasn't even close to what the local Walmart sported. Some things hadn't changed at all. The classic architecture of the white-pillared sanctuary, balanced by a smaller building on each side. The dozen or so parked cars and all the lights and activity were centered near the smallest of these, the one I recalled that was known as the Fellowship Hall. I parked among the others and watched until the men from the prayer group began to descend the steps. Meeting over. Paul Marshall greeted me with a smile.
Right on time. Sometimes these guys get to talking after the lesson and we run a little long. Tonight everyone seemed eager to get going. I'm thinking that has more to do with the World Series than God's calling.
Were you?
Oh, no. I like sports well enough, but basketball is more my thing. I'll catch the results on the news later.
He gestured toward the table that held a ragged assortment of cookies and a nearly empty coffee carafe.
Come in. Have something if you'd like.
When I declined the refreshments, he ushered me toward the circle of chairs the others had left in place.
So, I'm afraid I don't have a clear picture of what's been going on with the finances at Heavenly Treasures. Althea is a dear, dear woman, but she couldn't seem to explain it all. Remind me again. Something about one of the other volunteers noticing that $100 was missing?
I perched on the edge of the metal folding chair with my notes in my lap.
That's how it began, yes. Elsa Higgins is like a grandmother to me. She took me in when I was orphaned at 15, and she raised me through what are probably the toughest years when dealing with a teenage girl.
He chuckled, apparently having heard that tale from many parents over the years.
Anyway, she volunteers at the thrift shop and noticed that money was missing. A $100 bill was especially remarkable because she knew exactly where she had put it. Elsa's 93 years old, and a lot of people might discount her memory or claim she's getting senile. Let me assure you, she isn't. So when it looked like the blame for the missing money might fall on her, I offered to help figure out what had happened to it.
He was nodding thoughtfully through all this, and I couldn't be certain how much was new information and how much was repetition, but he let me go on. I told everything I knew about the revenues from the shop dropping off in recent months, and how Elsa had noted all the cash transactions for several days, and the discrepancies we found when we'd compared those with the cash shown on Carol's deposit slips. I knew the cash must be disappearing after it was taken from the register up to the front office. It pretty much had to be either the bookkeeper Carol or Benny Stevens. I was leaning toward Benny because, frankly, I discovered that his personal financial situation wasn't the greatest. Maybe he simply needed the money. But when I interviewed him, this was the day before he died. He seemed genuinely worried that he could be held responsible for the shop's dwindling revenues and that he could lose his job.
But we're talking about $100 here or there, aren't we? Granted, if Benny needed the money, I would have wanted to counsel him about that, see if we might help. But to take away his job over $1,000 or less...
I am afraid it's a lot more than that.
I pulled out a spreadsheet I'd created showing the figures I'd come up with.
Of course, these are only projections. Dealing with cash, there's no absolute proof.
When I handed him the page, his eyes grew wide.
How did you come up with this?
I went back to the deposit slips I found in the file cabinet at the shop. Prior to 6 months ago, this was the average income.
I pointed to one of the columns.
Beginning in May, you'll notice it dropped just a little. This slight drop continued for 3 or 4 weeks. Then it began to plummet steadily. Compare the first week of this month with what the shop was earning last spring. It's less than half.
Marshall had gone very still in his chair now.
I'm sorry to say it, but I'd estimate there's more than $100,000 missing right now. If the pattern continued, the loss to the shop within a year's time would easily be twice that much.
He swallowed hard.
I had no idea.
I don't think anyone did. I know Althea does her best, but she can only report what she knows.
Yes. I don't see how any of the blame for this could fall to her.
I'm not saying that at all, of course. Now that I've had access to more of the records, I really believe it's the bookkeeper, Carol Meyerson, who's behind it.
How much to say at this point about the Day couple and all the aliases? I decided to save that for later. The preacher was becoming agitated, leaving his chair and pacing across the large room.
How much does anyone know about Carol? I heard she's not a church member but was hired when she answered an ad or something?
Yes, I believe that's true. Hiring her was Benny's responsibility. The deacons and I had made the decision a few years ago to hire Benny to oversee the shop completely. He scheduled the volunteers and made the recommendation that we hire a bookkeeper, as that added responsibility was too much for Althea.
I understand.
Surely, Benny was not taking advantage of his position there.
He seemed genuinely distressed at the thought, and I tried to reassure him.
The more I've learned, the more I believe it was Carol who was embezzling the cash. Please don't think that I'm out to smear Benny's name or Althea's.
So what do we do?
What I need now is to find more proof, so complete access to the shop's records. I asked Althea if Benny kept any accounting records on his computer, and she didn't seem to know. If it's all right with you, I'd need to access his computer, compare what might be on it with what's on the one Carol used.
Of course, please do.
And if I do locate enough to prove that a crime has been committed, I need to know whether you, the church, will press charges. Frankly, there's no point in putting together all the evidence if the criminal will not even be arrested, and the police don't seem inclined to get involved unless you do. Sorry, that's putting it bluntly.
I understand.
He paused near the stained glass windows on the far side of the room.
Yes, we must. As unpleasant as the thought is, we simply cannot accept that great a loss to our mission work. Let me give some thought to the hiring of a new manager. Losing Benny Stevens was very upsetting to the congregation, so I have to tread a bit carefully about replacing him. In the meantime, if you could document each day's receipts and get them to Althea.
Certainly. I'll go back to the shop tomorrow and start digging, and I will thoroughly go through the files I took from Carol's desk.
I straightened my papers and stood up.
Marshall walked over to shake my hand, and I assured him I would do my best. But as I walked back to my car, I wondered if my assumptions about the bookkeeper being the master criminal were true. There was still the possibility that some of the church members could get tangled up in the web as well. Chapter 39. Rodney was not feeling better by morning. In fact, his gut was on fire and he'd not held his dinner down. Cece fussed over him, offering comfort food, which he couldn't even think about. She went down to the hotel gift shop where she picked up more antacids and a thermometer. His temperature was 102. "We'll stay here a few days longer. No problem," she assured him. But he could see the worry on her face. They'd meant to be a lot farther from Albuquerque before they relaxed. They wanted to be in Billings tonight, Missoula, or even closer to their Oregon goal by tomorrow night. It wasn't going to happen. And Cece stressed when things didn't go according to plan. "I'm going to run out to the 2 other post offices, and I need to start getting rid of those certain items." She was referring to the costume she'd devised for her Carol Meyerson persona. The padded undergarments, larger clothing, and old lady-style blonde wig. Part of the reason for her success over the years was that she never left connections. The clothing could not have been left in Albuquerque, because you never knew who would find the wig or a recognizable shirt or dress, and you never knew how or when one of those items would make its way into the hands of the cops. She had an absurd vision of one of her Carol dresses getting donated to Heavenly Treasures and instantly being recognized by her co-workers.
"Where's my painting?"
he rasped, his gut flaring at the thought of it in the trunk of the car downstairs in the parking garage. "Right here, honey. Remember? We brought it up with us last night." She opened the armoire and showed him the tube containing the Picasso.
"I want it with me."
She carried it to the bed, and he cuddled the tube against his side. "I've put out the Do Not Disturb sign, and there's a glass of water right here on the nightstand. I should be back in an hour or so." He closed his eyes and nodded. A moment later, he heard the door open and close. After months in Albuquerque, where nearly anything was no more than a 20-minute drive, she'd forgotten what it was like to drive in a huge city with all the connected suburbs. At the time she'd posted the boxes, it seemed wise to spread them out, have them arrive in various post offices. From their downtown location, she'd retrieved the only packages she'd sent to Denver when they arrived in rush-hour traffic yesterday. Now she brought up the addresses of the other 2 on her phone and began to plan a route, lamenting the fact that one was in southeast Aurora and the other in Westminster, at complete opposite ends of the huge metroplex. She'd be lucky to get the first of these done in an hour's time. No sense in disturbing Rodney's rest to tell him that. Odds were he would sleep all morning anyway. She set up the map to give verbal instructions and headed out of the underground parking garage. Chapter 40. Being back in the office, seeing Benny Stevens' empty desk provided a sharp reminder that the financial crime wasn't the only item on my agenda. I still couldn't let go of the idea that a random bee didn't just happen to make its way into this room where it stung the one person who was highly allergic. As I searched for evidence of the missing money, I needed to be on the lookout for anything that seemed out of the ordinary in regards to the manager's death as well. I set my thermos of coffee on top of the metal file cabinet. I'd quickly learned that the coffee station for the volunteers was normally empty or down to the dregs, and stared around the room for a place to begin. Since I'd been rushing through Carol's desk the other night, I decided it could use a closer look, so that's where I started. The main file drawer on the right was empty, of course. I'd taken everything to show to Althea, and there was a smaller drawer with basic office junk. A small stapler, a box of paper clips, pair of scissors, generic mailing labels, 4 or 5 pens, and 2 mechanical pencils. The center drawer held postage stamps, more pens, a purse-sized pack of tissues, and a chapstick. Hadn't there been a couple of other personal items in there before? I couldn't remember anything specific, just a general impression that the drawer had held more. The left side of the desk had an open compartment where a stack of copy paper and a box of large envelopes were stored. It was likely where Carol would have set her purse during the workday. The power cord for the computer went through a small hole in the desktop and trailed down a power strip onto the floor behind the envelopes. I didn't spot anything related to actual bookkeeping or finances. A small wastebasket sat in front of the space, and I dumped its contents onto the desk. Nothing of interest there. Even the wadded-up notes consisted of a grocery list with all the items marked out and a reminder to call home after 1 o'clock, which told me nothing. I smoothed out the 2 notes and set them aside. At the very least, they could provide samples of Carol's handwriting, in case the police should find that relevant. I stood up straight, nursing the crick in my neck. What next? Reverend Marshall had given me permission to search Benny's desk and computer, in case he'd also kept copies of financial records. I felt fairly certain the police had already gone through the desk, but it couldn't hurt to look. And Benny, who'd been quite a bit younger than Carol, might have set up online access to the bank accounts. It would be one more way for me to cross-check and verify the information from the deposit slips. I plopped myself onto his chair and looked around. Here, too, miscellaneous office supplies dominated the drawer space. Benny's included copies of the schedules and blank pages to be used for future months. I did come upon a small notebook, in which he'd noted his computer passwords. Not terribly secure, considering anyone who wanted to get into his computer, yes, like me, would find the information quite easily. This computer was slightly more modern than the one at the other desk, but it still took an eternity to boot up. I poured myself some coffee and noticed that the buzz of sounds from the sales room was picking up. Customers had discovered Heavenly Treasures was open again. Benny's home screen wasn't password protected, so it was an easy enough matter to take a gander at what programs he used. Frankly, there wasn't much. A word processor and spreadsheet, quick links to some solitaire games. I opened the browser and clicked to see his recent search history. It seemed he spent time on Facebook, so I went there, where I discovered he'd mostly posted things about the thrift shop, little community service announcements about the shop's hours, and occasionally about some exceptional item that had come in. Interesting. There must be shoppers, beyond those who needed baby gear and common household items, who were on the lookout for antiques and pricier pieces. Seemed like a good service for the manager to provide, letting them know about unique offerings. His latest post showed a decorative pewter box with little claw feet and a miniature scene worked in metal on the top. I didn't remember seeing the piece in the shop, but since it was literally the land of 10,000 things, that wasn't surprising. There were other posts about fine china collections, and one for an intricate hand-crocheted blanket purported to be more than 50 years old. Fascinating as all that was, I had to remember that I was looking for banking transactions, so I went back to the browsing history. Tops on the list were a couple of antiques appraisers, where it appeared Benny had searched out the values of items, some of them matching what he'd posted to the social media pages. By the names of some sites, I couldn't tell what they would be, so I simply began clicking each one in turn. By the time I reached the 5th or 6th web address on the list, I was getting pretty quick about it. Click, take a glance, move on. Until I came to findamatch.com. The click revealed it to be a dating site, and a scroll down the page made it clear that this was a gay men's dating site. Uh-oh, Benny, what were you doing here? Back at the listing of his browsing history, I quickly saw that this was not one isolated visit. Benny Stevens had spent quite a lot of time at Find a Match. This was research of an entirely different kind. I knew that many religious groups were becoming more accepting of gays, trans, and all the other versions of a person's sexual preferences. Maybe Benny's church was one of those. But I didn't think any of the ones resembling mainstream religion condoned dating for married people with kids. I had to admit, it was pretty gutsy of Benny to use the computer here at the shop for his searches. Of course, it really wouldn't do to use the home computer for that either. I leaned back in the swivel chair to think about this. The implications became staggering the more I thought about it. This knowledge could be fuel for blackmail at the very least. Excommunication came to mind. And what about murder? Could someone have intentionally put the bee in Benny's desk drawer and removed his EpiPen, the only means he had of saving his own life? The idea sent a sick feeling to the pit of my stomach. Suddenly my doubts about the man's death went from viewing it as a coincidence to knowing it was somehow connected with his deep secret. Who would have been most likely to take action? The wife, a lover, one of the church officials, maybe the Reverend Marshall himself? It could be anyone within the church, anyone at the shop, maybe even a neighbor or, who knows, his garage mechanic. Okay, stop this. My mind could take the scenario in any direction, but I had to narrow down the suspects to someone with access to this office and this desk. Carol Meyerson. She worked alongside the man for 6 months, so it was logical that she would have known about his allergy. And she could have easily glanced over the partition between their desks, wanting to ask a simple question perhaps, and spotted the forbidden images on his computer screen. Maybe the stolen money wasn't at all the reason she'd disappeared. Not if she was a murderer. Chapter 41. I reached for my coffee, which was now tepid, and movement caught my eye. Bonnie Stevens appeared at the edge of the cubicle divider, her preschooler kid attached to her leg.
Hi, Charlie. Sorry to bother you.
She didn't look good. Her face was haggard, and I'd swear she had lost 10 pounds since I last saw her. Her slacks had a couple of days' worth of wrinkles, and there was some kind of food stain on her blouse. I had a hard time seeing her in this condition as a suspect, but yet, grieving widow or guilt-ridden killer?
I came by to get Benny's personal things out of your way. Reverend Marshall says he'll hire someone to take over the shop.
Sure. I clicked to back away from the dating site and made the computer go to a screensaver, this one of fish swimming around in a brilliantly colored aquarium. Bonnie moved in, retrieving the framed family photo and a potted plant.
I gave him this. I always thought his workspace was too bland.
Can I get you a box or something? I edged past her and the shy child. When I returned less than a minute later, she had a little stack on the desk. Besides the photo and potted plant, there were some notepads imprinted with Benny's name and a gold pen. She hastened to explain where each item came from, lest I think she was helping herself to property from the shop. As if most of the others weren't already doing that.
Mommy, I like this,
said the little boy, holding up a small metal box with claw feet.
Oh, I don't think that's...
Bonnie took the box and handed it over to me.
Thanks, yes, that definitely belongs to the shop.
I carried it out of sight before the kid could pitch a fit and guilt me into just giving it to him. It could wait safely in Carol's desk drawer until they were gone. If it had been important enough for Benny to post as an antique on their Facebook page, It definitely wasn't a child's toy.
Are you doing all right, Bonnie? I mean, well, money-wise?
She nodded, placing the potted plant next to the box I'd brought.
Our insurance man said he'd stay on top of the claim and get me some money as quickly as he could.
$1 million, as I recalled.
In fact, several from the church took up a little collection to see me through for a week or two, and I can't believe how generous everyone has been with food.
Good. I imagine it's a challenge keeping teens fed. For the first time, a little smile crossed her face. She picked up the box of possessions and headed toward the door.
Thanks for everything.
Other than bringing the container and standing aside while she picked up things, I couldn't think what I'd done. Well, I did close out the dating website before she or her kid could see it, but she had no way of knowing that. I watched as Bonnie walked toward the front door, the various volunteers stopping to greet her and offer hugs along the way. As a wife who might have caught her husband cheating, she could certainly have motive to get rid of him, but I certainly didn't see any suspicion or reservation on the faces of her friends. She was either innocent or she was the smoothest killer in history. My thoughts went back to Carol. Motive, avoiding getting caught stealing. Means, as yet unknown. Opportunity, worked right here in the same room with the victim. Once I saw Bonnie get into her minivan, I went back to Carol's desk and retrieved the small metal box. I should show it to Mariah Blinker and ask whether she knew anything about the decorative piece, where it came from, how much it might be worth. It seemed to be an item Benny had shown interest in and posted on the website just before he died. But Mariah only shrugged.
I don't recall this piece at all. I did often take items to Benny if I thought they could be extra valuable, but not this one.
What about the other volunteers? Maybe someone in the donation intake area took it directly to him? She shrugged again.
No idea.
I went out back and asked. No one seemed to be familiar with the little box. Nancy Pomeroy opened the lid and looked inside.
Some kind of yellowish powder in it. Maybe the donor used it to store spices or something.
Although when she took a sniff, she didn't offer an opinion as to what spice that might be. She handed the box back. In the shop, I held the box up and asked a few others. Dottie, Elsa, Eugene, Kylie. They all shook their heads.
Charlie, Dottie and I are supposed to get off work in 15 minutes, Elsa said. Will you be ready to go by then, or should we find a little something extra to do?
She looked a little tired, and I was feeling stumped in my searches. I'll be ready. Just come in the office when your replacement arrives. I went back to Benny's desk and took one more look at his browser, typing in the word bank to see if I could find a login to a banking site. But no, nothing came up. Apparently Carol Meyerson and Althea Benton were the only two involved with the banking, and they were both old school enough to handle everything in writing rather than electronically. Okay then, that was that. I put Benny's notebook with the passwords back in the center drawer, and that's when I noticed it. Yellowish residue inside the drawer. I knew immediately what it was. The medical investigator's report said there was bee pollen near Benny's hand, which was in the drawer when he died. The decorative metal box was sitting right here, beside the computer screen, since I hadn't yet decided on a safe place to stow it away. I opened it. The yellow residue looked the same. I would need to get an expert to verify it, but I knew the answer was staring me in the face. A bee got into the office because it had been carried here inside this box. And I could only imagine how riled up a bee would feel after being shaken around inside a closed container. Mad enough to sting the first person who opened the box. I could picture the scene. Benny sitting here in this chair opens the box he's planning to appraise. Bee flies out and nails him on the hand. He tries to shake it off at the same time he's reaching into the drawer for the medical device that will save his life. But the EpiPen isn't there. He's panicking, but his airway is closing and he doesn't have the strength to stand up or call for help. Oh, God, what a horrible way to go. Chapter 42. Cece was exhausted from the traffic, and she hadn't yet disposed of her old bits of disguise. She was sitting in the car in a parking lot, searching her phone for a place that would take used clothing donations. Ironic, she thought, since less than 2 days ago she'd been working at just such a shop. The post office branch she'd chosen, unknowingly, in Longmont wasn't the best neighborhood, but she did find a Goodwill store a few blocks away. She headed there now, fully aware that she had more than $100,000 in the trunk, and it wouldn't do to get separated from it, or to drive into an area where a carjacking would be a possibility. It was a real pain getting rid of the disguise in multiple places, but they had to keep their wits about them and stay off the radar. And they couldn't take the chance that Colorado law enforcement wouldn't get the word about what had been going on in neighboring New Mexico. Rodney talked a lot about the good old days, and he was right. There was a time when there was no national and international criminal databases, no way for various agencies to effectively share information. But they had to face the fact that those much more carefree days were gone. One couldn't be too careful. She sighed, pulling out into traffic again. What was it her mother used to say? Oh, what a tangled web we weave. Screw that, she said aloud to the empty car. I'm not senile yet, and I can figure this out. 3 more turns, and she spotted the big Goodwill sign. One end of the building was devoted to accepting donations, and she pulled up to the familiar blue bins. Of course, it would have been better to do this when no one was around to gawk at the pink car or at her, but there was no way she'd come back to this neighborhood after dark. The trash bag filled with size 12 clothing went into the bin, and she was off. It was another 6 blocks to the entrance ramp for the interstate, so she found a gas station where she topped off the tank and dropped her bulky padded undergarment into a greasy garbage dumpster at the back. It was strange, watching her alternate body so unceremoniously dumped. She'd sewn that get-up herself. And if the day ever came when she needed another great disguise, she could do it again. She held back at tossing in the old woman-style wig. Someone finding the body padding and the wig in the same place might put 2 and 2 together. She left it, like a plump, furry animal, to ride in the trunk. Right now, she needed to get back downtown and check in on Rodney at the hotel. A trickle of worry coursed down her spine. If he was truly sick and needed medical care, how would she handle that? She put the thought aside, deal with it when and if it really happened. What she found when she finally reached their room was only slightly reassuring. Her husband was still in bed, still in misery, although his fever had come down. What shall I do? Do we need to get a doctor? It had occurred to her that this was a classy enough hotel, and they had plenty of money. A doctor could probably be summoned to the room. He shook his head, one arm still around the tube containing his prized painting. Must have been something I ate. I shall feel better in the morning. He looked up from his pile of pillows. You're tired, darling. Why don't you go down to the restaurant and have a decent meal? I can have some soup sent up for you. No, not yet. I need to ride this out. I should just order room service. I feel bad leaving you alone again. Really, love, the smell of food would do me in. I'd rather you went and enjoyed your own dinner. She kissed him on the forehead and left the room after adding a tailored blazer to her jeans and businesslike shirt. Surely there was a restaurant, either on the premises or nearby, that wouldn't require she actually dress up for dinner. The pub-style hotel bar proved perfect for her needs. She ordered a gin and tonic and settled into her small booth. She would relax for a few minutes and then order a seafood and pasta meal. As much as she loved Rodney, it was actually a bit of a relief to simply have dinner and a drink, without his old man grousing about either the menu or the service. Yes, things were more genteel in England. She got that. She just grew tired of hearing about it. The first sip of her drink went down smoothly, and she felt the pressures of the day easing out of her muscles. When the server noticed her glass was nearly empty, she smiled at the young man and said yes, she would have another, and the pasta primavera as well. She hadn't checked her email all day, but didn't expect much. She really had no friends other than Rodney, but she wasn't going to dwell on that. And she rarely subscribed to lists that would bombard her with messages. Only 3. Her hairstylist confirming her appointment for Thursday. She clicked the button to cancel it. 1 message from Phil Jackson, the good-looking doctor from Donner Hospital. Delete. 1 from the chairman of the Theater Guild Board, wondering when she would have the deposit for their architect. Ha, never. She deleted that one too. Her second drink arrived, along with assurances that her dinner would be ready in just a few minutes. She gave the young man a smile and hoped his ingratiating give-me-a-bigger-tip manner wouldn't become too cloying. While her mind was back in Albuquerque, she decided to see what was going on back there. Had anyone at Heavenly Treasures reported their suspicions about the money? Had anyone remarked that she had not attended Benny Stevens' funeral and had not shown up at work again, although she realized it was impossible for that sort of news to make the internet. She should have friended 1 or 2 of the volunteers to get in on the gossip. She did a quick search on Albuquerque and Heavenly Treasures. The only thing that came up was the thrift shop's official website, showing the history, the shop hours, and talking about the mission work it supported. Yada yada. Albuquerque and Theater Guild was another story. A link appeared to the Channel 7 news page and the story about the $250,000 donation by Baxter and Company. And there was her picture, smiling and accepting that big cardboard check. Crap. They'd been so careful, and Rodney had brilliantly interrupted the video news crews. So where did this come from? Someone among the small crowd must have snapped it with their phone, and the TV station probably even paid for it, since they had nothing better. She looked again. Her face was in profile, so not the best angle for someone to recognize her. Still, it was not Carol, but Cece was the easier woman to recognize now. Her meal arrived, but her appetite had gone. She poked around and picked out some of the shrimp and a few of the vegetables, but the pure enjoyment of the dinner alone was gone. She should tell Rodney about the photo online, but she really didn't want to. Chapter 43. Bees were swarming all around me, landing on me. I couldn't feel their stings, but the panicky feeling was there. I woke up with the sheet tangled around my legs, my face buried in my pillow. I lifted my head to see a brilliant sunrise showing at the bedroom window. Drake was gone, and I remembered he'd said he had an early start this morning. I slipped my arms into my terry robe and wandered toward the kitchen, fuzzy-headed but still feeling disturbed by the dream. Freckles brought me back to reality, wiggling and happy to see me, eager for her breakfast. The coffee maker was on, my favorite morning blend all ready for me, along with cinnamon muffins my dear hubby had brought home from the bakery yesterday. Here was a guy with a demanding customer and a full day ahead, and he'd still thought to leave me some breakfast and a little love note. My heart warmed. We needed to find some time for a getaway, although autumn is one of the busiest seasons for him. I would put my mind to it and come up with something fun, but with flexible timing. Freckles dashed back inside, and I noticed there were lights on next door already. Elsa and Dottie were on the work schedule again for Heavenly Treasures. Dottie would drive them because as of last night, I hadn't committed, although the dream about the bees meant Benny's death was still weighing heavily on my mind. I poured and doctored my coffee with some cream. The first sip helped clear my head, and I began thinking about my investigation. Reverend Marshall had entrusted the shop keys to Elsa, but he would soon have a new manager in place, so if I wanted access to the office, especially Benny's computer, I needed to move quickly. Much as I would love to hang out at home, snuggle my doggie, and have more than one of those cinnamon muffins, I really should be at the thrift shop today. I settled for a quick cuddle and a game of fetch with Freckles, ate 2 of the muffins, and checked for any emails or texts from my brother, who probably wished I was spending time at our own office rather than this unpaid investigation I'd gotten myself into. He only had a couple of questions, which I answered quickly. A steaming shower spray is a great place to think and plan, and I found myself reviewing what I'd learned yesterday and looking for the gaps that might lead me to answers. Of course, one of those glaring gaps was the shocker revelation that Benny Stevens had been cruising around on gay dating sites. I should have found his password and looked at his account there. An hour later, I was doing exactly that. Find a Match looked like a pretty extensive website, but once I located Benny's password in his little notebook, I went straight to his account. He'd focused strictly on finding male matches, and his criteria for interesting were of a similar type. Dark hair, in their 30s, good-looking but not necessarily male model types. I tried to figure out a way to narrow down the pages of handsome faces and only show those Benny had actually selected to contact. There wasn't an easy way. That seemed strange to me. Wouldn't a dating site want their members to quickly narrow down their choices? Or maybe that was the whole point, get people to spend as much time as possible browsing. If they paid for the service by the amount of time spent online, it would generate more revenue for the site provider. I have no idea how these things work. Trying a different tactic, I started looking for data about Benny's history with the site. How long he'd been a member, how recently he had browsed for new matches, that kind of thing. It appeared he'd been very active earlier this summer. Then there were no new searches for a stretch of time. Maybe he'd met Mr. Right? But in the past couple of weeks, there was more activity on the account, and he'd marked several new faces. I was beginning to get the idea that maybe a person's dating history got erased after a certain amount of time. I could see that working. You meet the right person, or you don't, but you wouldn't want the new lover to get into your account and see everyone else you'd been interested in. Egos can be pretty fragile in a new relationship. I could guess that maybe Benny had met someone and started up with them 4 months ago. Then there was a breakup. After the split, he began looking again. Like I said, I don't exactly know how these things work, and I don't have many friends who aren't either committed singles or happily married, so there was no one I could readily think of to ask. Then again, anyone looking at the Stevens family would assume Benny was, if not happily married, at least very committed to home and hearth, wife and kids. I couldn't think what to do next, and the website was beginning to creep me out a little, delving into this. I've always figured that what goes on behind anyone's bedroom doors is an extremely private matter. I logged out of the site, but I did stick the little notebook of usernames and passwords into my purse. The next person to take over this desk might not be quite so forgiving about the privacy stuff. Again, I asked myself what I hoped to accomplish with this knowledge. Benny's secret life could be a motive for blackmail, certainly, but how was it a motive for murder? Other than Bonnie's being the humiliated wife who just happened to have $1 million life insurance policy on her husband. The wife certainly knew about his allergy and where he kept his EpiPen. The only flaw in that theory was that Bonnie hadn't been in the shop in the days leading up to her husband's death. When had she taken the EpiPen? How had she delivered the bee to his desk? I drummed my fingers on the desk, but was getting no answers. Maybe a candy bar would help. I left the office and headed toward the vending machines. Elsa and Dottie had arrived. I gave each of them a quick greeting. The other volunteers were beginning to look familiar to me, and all seemed busy in their normal areas of the shop. I put in my $1 and opted for a Twix. Candy and cookie together. What's not to love? I stopped by the counter on my way back to the office and offered half of the Twix to Elsa. No argument from her. It's one of her favorites, too. Has anyone talked about whether Carol is coming in? I asked, even though I had every reason to believe she was gone for good.
A couple people were saying that they think she just quit. You know, after Benny died. She seemed a little nervous about the police asking questions.
My thoughts exactly. The pieces all fit. The pink Cadillac, the vacated house, the box with the various identities. And Carol Meyerson had not returned to the shop since that day. I'd gotten so engrossed in trying to figure out whether Benny's death was intentional that I'd become sidetracked in my resolve to put together enough evidence to turn the money theft case over to the police. There was one place I'd not thoroughly searched, Carol's browser history on the office computer. I hustled my little self back to the office and booted up her computer. I'd been so focused on the accounting entries and the banking aspects that I hadn't done a general look-see. And now I found that in the days before everything fell apart here at the office, Carol had been one busy little lady. Several travel sites showed searches for airline flights. She had selected itineraries for Phoenix and Houston. Some little memory came up. In the day couples past, there had been connections with both of those places. Scrolling a bit farther down the list of her recent searches, I found travel itineraries also for Chicago and Cleveland. Was this for real? Who booked trips to 4 different places, all spread out? It began to appear that sweet little Carol, who claimed not to know much about computers, was either masterminding something big, or she was planting so many seeds of evidence that it would be a colossal pain to sort it out and figure out what was real and which were red herrings. The only thing I could think of to do was see if the couple had flown out of Albuquerque. From there, it would take law enforcement and search warrants to track down where they had actually gone. I grabbed my purse and headed out. Chapter 44. You have no idea how many cars an airport parking lot holds until you've driven every inch of the place and looked at every vehicle. I started most logically with the long-term lot at the Albuquerque Sunport. A huge old pink Cadillac should stand out at a glance, but it didn't. Same with the hourly parking multi-level garage. I paid for the hour it had taken me to search it all, then headed across the street where the park and shuttle type places are. Nobody seemed to have seen a pink Cadillac, even though a couple of the attendants were clearly car aficionados whose eyes lit up when I described the vehicle. One of them let me drive through their entire lot just to look around. I had to come back and report no success, and he seemed just as disappointed as I was. So, okay, the whole airline reservation thing had been a ruse, and I'd just wasted most of a morning thinking they'd got on a plane. Well, as Ron says, a big part of investigative work is eliminating false clues so you can get on with the real ones. This called for a Big Mac and fries, and I knew exactly where the closest ones could be found. I pulled through the drive-up, got my lunch, and headed home with it, nibbling fries the whole way. Gotta eat those babies while they're hot and crispy. Freckles was thrilled to see me, and she helped with the last of my fries. I opened my laptop at the dining table and went back to where I'd been a couple days ago. The whole slew of different identities for a woman with the initials CM was still really bugging me. So I found a facial recognition app that let me scan the driver's license photos and compare them. Then I went to the news story I'd seen about the Theater Guild fundraiser, the one where the CC Day was accepting a big donation check. They matched. All of them. Problem was, I had pretty well figured out that much. What I needed was evidence that this same woman was Carol from the shop, and I couldn't quite put that together without a picture of Carol. At a glance, they looked nothing alike, but that could be due to other types of disguise trickery. I went back through the various stories I'd found when I searched these alternate identities, coupled with terms such as arrest or trial. Only one included a photo of the suspect. It was a younger version of the slender woman I'd seen in the Cadillac, not the Carol I'd seen at work each day. Frustrated, I picked up my phone, thinking I would ask Ron's advice. But instead of tapping on the phone icon, my eye caught the app for the nanny cam. Before Benny discovered it and snatched it away, it had been in the sales area of the shop for 2 days, and then in the office for a little more than a brief moment. I opened the app and went back through the video. In the sales area, I had concentrated on aiming the camera so it looked down on the scene and photographed the handling of cash. I had lots of footage of the top of Elsa's head. However, the wide angle did allow me to see anyone taking cash from the register and carrying it to the office. And I remembered Benny had been the one to pick up the money on the 2 days I filmed. After all, he'd been my main suspect at that time. Then I'd move the camera into the office and set it up to view both of the desks, hoping to catch Benny stuffing a few bills into his own pockets before he put it on the bookkeeper's desk. I forwarded ahead to the video showing that view. And there was Carol, slipping money into her top desk drawer. But the camera was behind her, so all I saw was the back of her fluffy blonde hair, her back, and the activity on her desk. Did she stand up and move around the office during the short time the camera had been in place? I began playing the video at a slower speed. And yes, there was the moment when she walked in, right after I'd set up the camera. Somehow I had zoomed right past that. She never looked directly at the camera, which would have been ideal for my purposes, but her face was mostly visible. I found the one moment when the view was closest to ideal and captured that as a screenshot. More telling was the fact, believing she was alone, she did a little adjustment to her clothing. A tug at the lower edge of her bra sort of shifted several things. In that fraction of a second, I could tell that her breasts, belly, and waistline all moved in unison. A real body doesn't do that. Well, not unless one is jumping around in some kind of Zumba move. Carol was wearing something under her clothing to pad her figure. And since that's not what women normally do, we all want to look slimmer, not pudgier, it became apparent she was wearing a costume. The facial recognition software was finished with the screenshot of Carol's face, and I had asked it to compare with the best of the CM Day photos. A match. Now I knew who our thief was, and there was likely a 1 in 4 chance that I had her real name. The police might not love those odds, but it was something. I called Detective Gary Broadman, the cop who had interviewed everyone after Benny's death. If he wasn't the one to report the money theft to, at least he could steer me in the right direction. I related how I'd spoken with Reverend Marshall and the church would be willing to press charges, and I gave the gist of the evidence I'd gathered. If I'd hoped for wild enthusiasm for him to investigate the case and catch the thief who'd taken probably a large amount of cash from the thrift shop's worthy cause, I didn't get it. Broadman sounded distracted, but he did agree to see me the next day if I could bring all my evidence down to the station. I stacked the pieces of identification neatly back into the box in which I'd found them. My screenshots and facial recognition results got saved as images I could email to him. Then I dipped into the large banker's box of files I'd brought home after showing them to Althea Benton. I needed to put them in an understandable sequence and match the dates with the days Elsa had documented the cash intake. That mass of papers was spread over my dining table when I spotted Dottie's car pulling into the driveway next door. I glanced at the clock and I saw it was late enough that the workday was over for the two ladies. Instead of going directly inside Elsa's, Dottie headed across my front lawn and rang the bell. "Guess what I found," she said, eyes bright and faintly breathless with excitement. She held out a small plastic bag with something inside. An EpiPen. "What? Where did you find it?" "In the wastebasket at the shop. I noticed nobody emptied the trash for a few days, things piling up, so I went around to take care of that. This here pen thing in the big trash near the coffee pot." "Anyone could have put it there." "I know you're thinking of evidence, so I put it in this bag, and I did it without touching the pen at all. And I got that girl, Kylie, to take a picture of it laying there in the trash, and she already sent it to you." "Wow, Dottie, great thinking. I'll see that the police get it." I told her I had an appointment the next day, although I didn't mention the detail that the topic was actually about the money, not about Benny's death. Since Broadman was convinced the bee sting was an accident, that whole subject needed more investigation, and was probably best taken up with my old homicide detective buddy, Kent Taylor. But the pen was valuable evidence. I thanked Dottie once again, and she headed back to Elsa's. Back at my table, I held the baggie up to the light and looked at the pen from different angles. A peek at my messages showed the photo of the pen in the midst of crumpled napkins, ripped sugar packets, and old coffee filters. Dottie must have partially emptied the large trash bin and then spotted this, buried under other things. There was no way Benny would have put it there. So, who did? Chapter 45. Cece gave the hotel room one final search, checking every drawer, every corner, under the bed. Using a hand towel, she wiped down the surfaces, faucets, and door handles. It was a lifelong habit, and she couldn't even say why she did it. A maid would be in here within an hour or two. The removal of the linens and vacuuming of the carpet should take care of most traces they'd ever been here. Still, when you spent your life moving from city to city, always a short jump ahead of the law, you learn to look out for yourself. She found a tube of her lipstick underneath the bathroom vanity and congratulated herself on being so thorough.
"Almost ready, honey?"
She carried both of their toiletry cases from the bathroom and stuffed them into the suitcases. Rodney was still putting on his socks. How long could a man take to get dressed in the morning? She stifled the thought. He'd been sick, and although he insisted he was feeling well enough to travel today, she could tell by watching the slowness of his movements that he wasn't top-notch yet. The problem seemed to have been a stomach bug of some kind. Now she prayed she wouldn't catch it. They could not afford for both of them to be sick.
"I can call a bellman if you'd like,"
she suggested. He shook his head.
"I'll manage just fine, thanks."
His tone was terse, and she wasn't sure if that was irritation, she being overly solicitous, or was he subtly reminding her that they shouldn't do anything that would create a memory in an employee's mind. He enjoyed being a big tipper, but more than once a grateful waitress or pleased bellhop had remembered the handsome gray-haired man when the law came around asking questions. He was right. They could manage on their own. She consolidated their possessions into the 2 suitcases, although Rodney insisted he could carry the tube that held his painting. Increasingly, he did not want the valued item out of his sight. At last he finished tying his shoelaces and stood. She kept a close eye as he slipped his suit coat on and adjusted his tie. Ever the gentleman, even on a long road trip in the car. She had dressed much more comfortably. Jeans, a soft green sweater that brought out the dazzle in her eyes, and a lightweight blazer. Her hair was freshly washed, and she'd spiked it upward at angles, making her look slightly different from the photo that had appeared on the Albuquerque news site yesterday. They were heading north, and hopefully no one in this neck of the woods took much interest in New Mexico news. But she knew they needed to be careful. Baxter and Company, the donor, had far-reaching business connections. Rodney took the handle of his suitcase and stood aside so she could leave the room first. She shook her head, the towel still in hand. He stepped out into the hall, and she pulled her bag out beside his. She slung her large purse over her shoulder, wiped both inner and outer door handles with the towel, and tossed it back into the room before letting the door ease closed on its own. "We're off," she announced. He was moving slowly still, but within a few minutes they were downstairs in the parking garage. Bags in the trunk, she helped Rodney and the Picasso settle into the passenger seat, and she climbed in behind the wheel. They'd waited until the crush of morning traffic subsided, and now they headed toward I-25 and the straightest route of Denver. Billings, Montana by nightfall was her goal, but she didn't feel absolutely confident that Rodney's stamina would last the full 8 hours. Nonetheless, they needed to put some miles behind them now. She hit the interstate and settled back, loving Pinky's smooth ride. Her baby. Just across the Wyoming border on the outskirts of Cheyenne, she declared they needed a coffee break, so she pulled into the lot of a small diner in hopes of meeting 2 goals: coffee and a dumpster out back where she might get rid of the last of her Carol costume, the wig. Goal 1 accomplished. Goal 2, she decided against it. The little restaurant had not yet emptied any garbage for the day, and a blonde wig in the bottom of an empty, filthy container could easily be spotted. But a garage, where she paused to buy a road map for the sake of appearances, had exactly the right requirement for the disposal of the wig. Their bin was half filled with greasy rags, empty oil cans, and what looked like the paper towel debris from the public restrooms. No one surely would go browsing through that mess. She picked up a nearby dead tree branch and used it to poke the wig deep into the nasty collection. Rodney had settled back into his seat, eyes closed. He didn't complain, but she could tell he still didn't feel well. She turned the radio on, hoping for some soft music, but they weren't far north of Cheyenne when the old AM radio lost all signals. With nothing but her thoughts to keep her company, she found herself dwelling on the wrong things. How long would it take for the theater guild to realize the money was never going to show up in their account? How long before that snoopy girl at the thrift shop figured out that Carol knew far more than she'd admitted about how the bee got into Benny's desk? And how long should they keep traveling as Rodney and Cece? Maybe when they reached Montana, it would be the ideal time to switch to other names. Chapter 46. I lucked into a decent parking spot in the city garage near the police station and arrived for my meeting with Gary Broadman promptly at 2 o'clock, an expandable file tucked neatly under my arm. I'd spent the morning organizing all the shop's financial data as if I were about to give a presentation to a board of directors. As he had yesterday on the phone, Broadman seemed distracted by a dozen other things. But when I asked that he do me the courtesy of at least listening to what I had, he did settle down and push his other files aside. I started with the figures in Elsa's notebook, explaining how and why we had collected that data. When I compared her numbers with what was deposited in the bank on each of those days, he nodded. I showed him the short video clip that revealed Carol slipping cash into her desk drawer. Using the assumption that the bookkeeper had been helping herself to cash for weeks, if not months, the missing money could amount to several thousand a week, tens of thousands in the months she had been working there. I pushed a page toward him, where I had neatly laid out all the totals I had conservatively estimated. I'd already researched the law on what constituted grand larceny, and this definitely fit. This time he sat up straight and picked up the sheet to study the numbers.
"Who's going to press charges in the matter?"
he asked. Valid question. I told him about my conversation with Reverend Marshall. He'll cooperate fully.
"Why isn't he here at this meeting?"
I should have foreseen that, but I came up with an answer. He asked me to gather the information, put together the proof. I'm sure he would meet with you any time you like. Broadman rubbed his jaw.
"A case like this would go to major crimes. They've got forensic accountants and people in the division who really know this stuff. Afraid I can't tell you the name of anyone there, but I'll pass it along, and I'm sure they'll be in touch."
He gathered all my notes. So that was it. But I had saved my best card for last. I pulled out the metal box from the depths of my large bag, opening the lid to show him the collection of fake IDs.
"Where did you get these?"
Luckily, I had anticipated that question. They were in a house abandoned by the suspects. I met the landlord there and he let me in.
"What do you make of them?"
he asked, spreading out the various passports and driver's licenses in the same way I had done. I did a little basic internet search, looking for old news stories and such. Some of the names returned no hits at all, but a couple had interesting histories. It seems that, as Carolyn Malone, she's left other cities under a cloud of suspicion for theft.
"We'll check it out."
He gathered the evidence and glanced at his watch. I knew my time was finished here. I walked out of the squad room feeling a little down. I'd done what I could to clear Elsa's name as far as the missing money went. I'd found far more than I would have imagined in the beginning, but now it looked as though I wouldn't have the satisfaction of catching the crook or knowing how the case turned out, unless someone decided to share that with me. But I still had the other mystery, and even though it would mean letting go of my evidence in Benny's death too, I knew I had to turn it over to the police. I took the stairs down a floor and made my way to Kent Taylor's desk in the homicide division. I wouldn't say that Taylor and I are friends, but I'd like to think there's been a growing respect from him as we found ourselves chasing the same bad guys on more than one occasion. From being a young, smart-mouthed pain in his rear, I hope now I'm regarded as someone who really can work out the details of a crime and one who doesn't waste his time. I'd like to believe all that, but the truth was that Taylor didn't exactly greet me with a smile and a hug when I walked in.
"Charlie,
Kent, do you have a minute?
One minute.
I gave the shortest possible version of what had happened at the thrift shop. Benny's sudden death, the medical investigator's decision that it was an accidental death caused by a bee sting, and the fact that, legally, the matter was closed. As I talked, he turned to his computer terminal and looked up the medical report.
Right. Accidental death. Severe anaphylactic shock.
I've come across some evidence that the sting might not have been accidental at all.
This better be compelling.
I had to think fast. Of course, I didn't have this case laid out nearly so neatly as the other, since I'd only come prepared to talk with Gary Broadman. But I pulled out my phone and showed the photo Kylie had sent me, the one of Benny's EpiPen in the trash. A person who knows he's in danger of suffering anaphylactic shock doesn't just misplace the medication that could save his life, and he most certainly wouldn't have thrown it in the trash. While Taylor took a moment to look at the photo, I kept talking. A dead bee was found in his desk drawer, in an office with a locked window and a closed door, and there was bee pollen in both the drawer and in a little box I later discovered in the office. I cannot believe all that is coincidental. I knew from past experience that Kent Taylor hates the word coincidence when he's investigating a crime. I had his attention now.
You're saying a bee was purposely introduced into his office, and some killer knew this crazed insect would attack the one person who could be killed by it?
Okay, so he was making it sound a little preposterous when he said it that way. When the bee is inside the desk drawer of the one person most likely to reach inside, yes, I think it's entirely possible. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly.
Charlie, I'm not saying I don't believe you. Maybe this scenario really could happen. But I need suspects, motives, something the district attorney won't laugh me out of the room when I present the case.
I've been thinking about all that. He held up one hand in a halt motion.
Okay, I can't stop you from thinking.
But
do you see this?
He pointed to an investigation file on his desk that was at least 4 inches thick.
If you've watched the news in the last 3 days, you know about this one. Brutal attack on a college co-ed, broad daylight, busy shopping center, and no one saw enough to lead us to her killer. The city's in a panic to catch this guy because his next victim could be anyone's wife or daughter or best friend.
I choked back a groan. I'd not listened to a newscast in more than a week.
Right now, this takes precedence over everything else in my little world. Until this killer is caught, my squad is running 24/7. I have nothing more to give, and not to minimize anyone's trauma over your bee sting victim, but until my desk clears off a bit.
I know. I understand. I stood up and wished him luck with the co-ed case. I walked out, knowing Taylor's desk would never be clear. His job consisted of the worst cases, the unending tragedies that befell people in this city almost daily. I wanted to be angry with him, but I couldn't. My energy was best directed elsewhere. As I drove toward home, I realized that this was simply the reality. The police had to concentrate their efforts on catching the killer who might go out and murder some other unsuspecting person, the guy whose anger was unlimited. Benny's death, tragic as it was, felt more personal. A vendetta, retaliation, revenge, perhaps. Someone had taken very precise measures to get rid of him and to disguise their actions so the death would appear accidental. And they would have succeeded. And that was exactly why I couldn't let it go. If I could gather enough evidence, present a strong case, maybe even get a confession, someone in authority would have to listen to me. It looked as if my work was cut out for me, and I felt the surge of adrenaline that would carry me onward. I arrived home a few minutes later to find Drake packing. Chapter 47.
There's a big wildfire at Yellowstone, and they've called out all the hell-attack aircraft and teams in the western states,
he told me as he rummaged in the bottom of the closet for his boots.
Apparently it's now threatening some of the major tourist areas.
What can I do to help?
I'd say you could come along, but you're not certified to actually be on the fire scene.
I was thinking more along the lines of making him some sandwiches for the trip.
Do you have to leave right away?
As soon as the paperwork comes through. If that's this afternoon, I'll get as far north as I can tonight, make the rest of the distance tomorrow.
I didn't want to distract him from his task. The Forest Service requires a whole list of very specific items for every firefighter, and there would be an inspection the moment he arrived, to make sure he had everything from the government-approved boots to the right underwear. Intrusive, yes, but that's the way it is. I left him to concentrate on all that. Freckles sensed the tension and all the hustle-bustle. I could see it in her expression and demeanor, wondering whether she'd be left behind or what would happen next. Dogs like their pack to be all together and sticking with the daily routine. Already she knew this was going to disrupt everything. I gave her a long hug and said the magic cookie word so she would follow me to the kitchen, where I made a couple of sandwiches for Drake, and she happened to catch a few bread crusts that dropped to the floor. In the other room, I heard Drake's cell ring and then his voice, low and intense, talking business. I added another sandwich to the lunch pack, plus a couple of apples, some peanut butter crackers, and some protein bars. Once he arrived at the fire scene, he would be fed well. They always provided plenty of food for the hungry crews, but for a pilot, those meals sometimes came many hours apart. I wanted him to have energy food he could grab during a 15-minute refueling pause. I carried the small cooler into the living room and set it near the front door. Drake was at the dining table with his sectional chart spread out, plotting the route he would take.
I can make Durango by dark, and if I take off at first light in the morning, I'll be in West Yellowstone by 1 p.m. tomorrow.
Got everything?
He glanced toward the door.
Yeah, most of the gear is with the ship, out at the airport.
This was it then. I carried some of the items out to his truck and we hugged. He cupped my face with his gentle hands and looked into my eyes.
Safe and sound, he said.
Safe and sound. I watched him drive away and swallowed the lump in my throat. We always did the ritual, and yet I always knew there could be one final time. The one where he wouldn't come back safe and sound. I turned and went back into the house, reminding myself that he would call when he could, hopefully once a day. We never knew how it would go. His part in the firefighting effort could last a few days or several weeks. And in the meantime, all I could do to make the days pass was to keep busy. Easier said than done, especially since I'd already done what I could toward my dual investigations. Gary Broadman had the financial data and would pass it along to Major Crimes, where someone else would take it up with Reverend Marshall. Kent Taylor had promised to look into Benny's death, although there was little hope he would get around to it any time soon. He hadn't expressly forbidden my continuing my investigation. In fact, if I read his words in the broadest sense, hadn't he practically asked me to come back with a viable suspect? Sure, no cop was going to ask a civilian to do his job for him, but he really wouldn't mind if a simple case could be wrapped up in a simple manner, would he? Simple case. I spread out the copies I'd kept of the various documents and photos. At this moment, I really wasn't seeing the simplicity in any of this. I carried a sandwich and a glass of wine out to our backyard gazebo and curled up in one of the chairs, thinking through everything I knew about Benny Stevens. His death had a spur-of-the-moment feel to it, as though someone's anger had flared up and they tossed his EpiPen into the trash. But whoever killed him had also taken the time to capture a bee and bring it into the office. Maybe the unlucky insect had just happened to be buzzing around the outbuildings where the donations were collected. And maybe this person who was angry with Benny had been able to trap it in the little box. I don't know, that seemed like too many maybes. Like Kent Taylor, I'd learned not to trust coincidences. I needed to figure out who was angry enough with Benny to go to those lengths to get rid of him. Benny had been in a mood, snapping at the volunteers, and not exactly Mr. Cheerful for a week or so before this happened. So what had set him off? I wondered if there was a way to track his movements in his final few days. I'd thought my time at Heavenly Treasures was done, but maybe I needed to go back and shake things up a little. Chapter 48. The air was so smoky that traffic slowed to half the normal speed, and flashing signs cautioned motorists about low visibility and not to stop beside the roadway. Cece squinted into the gloom, looking for a sign that would say how many miles to Bozeman. Her head was pounding from concentrating so intensely, and Rodney had developed a cough. She hoped if they could press on and get farther north, they would pass beyond the smoke, which the news was reporting was coming from a wildfire somewhere in Yellowstone. Already the route she'd originally planned toward Oregon would have to be changed. She couldn't imagine another full day or two of driving in these conditions. It was getting late in the afternoon, and the light was rapidly dwindling when she began to see signs that they were nearing the city. Billboards for local businesses, a junkyard, and a campground. She slowed the Cadillac even further and followed another car's taillights down the exit ramp. This didn't seem like the type of city to have luxury hotels, but all the standard chains were represented, and Cece didn't feel they had the option of being picky. She pulled in at the first 3-star place she spotted. "Sorry, all booked. Everyone's trying to get off the road," the clerk said when she walked in. "I just haven't had time to put up the sign yet." Cece thanked the young woman and went back out to the car. The next 3 places had lit up no vacancy signs, and she was beginning to feel a touch of worry. It was getting darker by the minute, and neither she nor Rodney had any business driving in less than optimal conditions. Finally, she got a positive response and pulled out enough cash to pay. If this room was 3 stars, it barely made the cut. But beggars couldn't be choosers. She got Rodney settled in the room, where he immediately kicked off his shoes and crawled under the covers, with his Picassos snugged up against him. Cece went back out to the caddy for the rest of their belongings. This wasn't a neighborhood where she felt safe leaving the boxes of cash, or really anything, in the car overnight, especially since she'd not been able to get a parking spot within view of their room. It took several trips back and forth before she had both suitcases and all the express mailboxes safely in the room. Rodney was lying on his back with an arm over his face, blocking the overhead light from his eyes. "Honey, did you put the metal box in your suitcase?" she asked. He peered out from beneath his arm.
"What, the strong box?"
"I can't find it anywhere in the car. I shined a flashlight around under the seats and everything."
"It's in the hidden compartment in the trunk, where I had the tube, where we always put it."
"No, it's not there." He went into a coughing fit, rolled toward the edge of the bed, and nearly fell off.
"Has to be. It's where we always put it."
She helped him up and brought him a plastic cup of water from the bathroom. "No, honey, I tell you." He was still coughing, but waved away the water. "Do you want to go out there and check? I'm telling you, I can't find it."
"Stay in the room with everything else,"
he managed while putting on his shoes. He was back in 5 minutes, his face pale and drawn.
"It's not there. You must not have packed it."
"Me? The box was always yours to watch over, yours to pack when we traveled." His face grew red and the coughing began again. Truthfully, neither of them had specific tasks. She apologized for snapping at him. It had been a stressful couple of days. Still, this was a disaster with even worse implications than if the cash had gone missing. If those documents fell into the wrong hands? Rodney sank down to sit on the edge of the bed once his cough subsided.
"What are we going to do?"
Cece paced the length of the room back and forth 5 times. "I'll phone the landlord, tell him where to find the box, and ask that he mail it to us."
"What if he opens it and looks closely at the documents?"
Right, bad idea. They couldn't risk him or anyone mentioning the multiple identities. If he doesn't find the box, who else might be likely to find it? The next renter who goes poking around in the kitchen cabinets? She parted the curtains and stared out into the dark, chewing at her lower lip. She couldn't even begin to fathom what someone would do with the information if they found it.
Should we turn back? With luck, we could get into the house and retrieve the box before it's found.
She thought of the long miles behind them, and for a moment she was tempted anyway. But then she remembered the empty drawer at her desk in the thrift shop, the questions over Benny Stevens' death, the camera he'd discovered in the office. If that evidence was now in the hands of the police...
No, we can't go back. The problem is, I'm not sure we can go forward either.
She felt as though a dark cloud had descended over their carefree plans. Rodney picked up a small tent-shaped card with an ad for pizza delivery.
I feel like I should eat something. Maybe if I get my strength back, I'll begin to think more clearly.
Pizza? Really? After the upset stomach you've had? I'll go out and pick up something, maybe a nice meat and potatoes kind of meal.
I actually feel like having a good dinner, somewhere we sit down and have a waiter bring the food.
We shouldn't leave the room, both of us at once.
She stared pointedly at the tube containing the painting, and then the boxes of cash.
Fine, I'll go do it myself.
He stood abruptly and picked up the plastic room key from the desk where she'd left it.
See you soon.
Rodney, let's don't bicker over this.
But he was gone. Chapter 49. Neither of them slept. Their alternate identities, those documents they had spent years acquiring and safeguarding, could now be in the hands of nearly anyone. Cece was right. They couldn't risk going back and walking straight into a trap. It would be no more than a few days before the board members figured out all that money they'd raised never did end up in their account. Someone would come to the house looking for them. No, just like Houston, Phoenix, and a number of other cities, Albuquerque was now in their past. They would not go there again, ever.
I've been thinking about Oregon,
Rodney whispered in the dark.
Me too.
I don't know that it's such a good idea anymore.
I agree. There's too much cooperation between police departments these days.
He'd had the same thought.
What about Canada? We have our real passports and we're close enough to the border. Maybe we take the back roads and use one of the smaller border crossings.
We don't want to stand out. Maybe a more crowded entry point, where they process hundreds of cars a day, is better.
He was silent for a couple of minutes.
You know the thing that makes us stand out, darling.
She nodded in the dark, and he could hear her sniffle.
We have to get rid of Pinky, and we have to do it in a way so that no one connects our faces to the car.
I know.
Her voice was thick, barely a whisper. He stretched his arm upward, and she rolled toward him to fit up against his chest. He held her for a few minutes before the urgency of their situation and thoughts of 100 little details made him restless.
Up with you, then,
he said, trying to put a cheerful note on it. She groaned.
I know, neither of us is rested, but we need to get moving. We'll repack our belongings, put the packets of cash in the bottom of each suitcase, and cover it with items of clothing. Leave out some clothes if you need to, but be sure to keep enough to conceal the money.
Once she was out of bed, Cece began to move quickly and quietly. It was 2 a.m., and they couldn't call attention to themselves by waking the other guests. Rodney used his pocket knife to open the express mail boxes, and she dumped the contents of her bag onto the bed. Stacked tightly, she fitted the money bundles from 2 of the boxes into her bag, the other 2 and the Picasso in Rodney's. She wrapped shirts and blouses around the cash, making it more difficult to detect. They were crossing an international border, and anything they carried could be subject to inspection. Cece's final touch, whenever they traveled internationally, was to pack their underwear on top of everything else. She'd learned along the way that customs officials often shied away from handling a lady's lacy underthings. As she worked with the bags, Rodney flattened the cardboard boxes and removed the labels. Too bad they didn't have a shredder with them, but he did his best to cut everything with their names on it into very small pieces. Those would be scattered over such a wide area no one could ever piece them together again. The boxes would be left off at the very first chance he spotted a recycling bin for them, where they would blend in with the discards of everyone else. The bedside clock ticked over to 2:59, and the two of them stood near the door, surveying the room. They'd rechecked the bathroom twice, and neither had put anything into the dresser drawers. As everywhere, Cece now made one final pass with a hand towel, wiping off fingerprints. The two large suitcases weighed more than when they'd arrived, but they hefted them into the trunk of the Cadillac. 2 shopping bags of clothing would be discarded somewhere, along with the flat boxes. Cece was staring fondly at the old car.
"We don't have to make the switch just yet,"
Rodney said. He'd already decided that Bozeman was a small enough town that the car would have drawn attention when they drove in. They should get a bit farther down the road. He handed Cece the keys. To all appearances, they were just 2 seniors taking a nice vacation to Canada, with not a care in the world. The air still smelled of smoke from the Yellowstone fire, but at this hour of the morning it was cool enough that the visibility was better. Still, they wanted to get away from the smoke and north of the interstate highway before traffic picked up, and the smoke thickened again. Cece headed west and took the first highway north, driving more slowly than usual. Rodney hoped it was her way of spending more time with her beloved Pinky, but he feared she was feeling poorly and might have caught the stomach bug that had laid him low. A thread of worry ran through him. They were not in the clear yet, not by any means. Chapter 50. I'm not good at sleeping alone anymore, but Drake gets enough out-of-town work that I've learned to cope. Of course, this time it didn't help that I was still mentally juggling 2 investigations and trying to decide what to do next. After the 10th time of reminding myself that the police and the church had what they needed to press charges against Carol Meyerson, I was able to put that one aside. But it bothered me that the longer Benny's death went unsolved, the greater chance the killer would get away with the crime. Around 4 a.m., I finally got out of bed and went to make myself some hot chocolate. The only way I was going to catch the killer was to plant a seed, some kind of a time bomb that would make the person react. I simply had too many suspects to go about questioning and re-questioning each of them, in hopes that their story would change. It might be different at a police station where the intimidation factor was high, but I had to admit, they simply weren't afraid of me. So what could I do? With mug in hand, I picked up my phone and retreated to a corner of the sofa. Going through my photos, I'd studied the pictures I'd taken of the antique box used for transporting the bee. Everyone at the shop had seen it already, so it wasn't likely to bring a reaction. I could stand up and make an announcement about Benny's time on the gay dating website. Made loudly enough, that seemed sure to grab someone's attention. It would also have the unfortunate effect of trashing the dead guy's reputation, something his family didn't really deserve. I puzzled over the dilemma until I began to get sleepy. How would I get the killer to react? Dawn was showing around the windows, so I dragged myself out of my half-doze and decided I'd better get a shower and start the day. A bit later, I had let Freckles out the back door when Elsa spotted me.
"There's a mandatory meeting of all the volunteers at the shop this morning,"
she called out. I walked over to her back porch.
"Reverend Marshall wants everyone to hear the announcement about the new shop manager. He called last night, but I guess he doesn't have your number since you aren't really officially on the list. Everyone is to show up at half-hour before the regular time."
I'll be there. Now I needed inspiration. Fast. We all gathered in the open area between the buildings, the spot where donors brought pickup loads of items and backed up to the big garage doors to drop them off. It was the only spot uncluttered enough that 30 people could fit. Paul Marshall wasn't tall enough to be seen through the crowd until someone brought out a sturdy coffee table of solid oak. He stepped up and called for attention.
"I know this seems a bit formal, but I have a couple of announcements. Firstly, for those who weren't at Sunday's service," was he looking at me? "Mrs. Bonnie Stevens wishes to convey her thanks to everyone who has been so supportive since Benny's death. She sent all your casserole dishes and serving bowls with me, and you can pick up your items from my car as soon as we're finished here. And may I add my personal thanks to our church family for taking such good care of the Stevenses in their time of grief." I had positioned myself near the front, where I could appear to be paying rapt attention to the pastor's words, but could also watch the reactions of everyone else. At this point, most were merely nodding politely. We were only doing what anyone would do. "And now, on to business. The shop needs a manager, and there are big shoes to fill, as Benny did such a wonderful job of keeping the schedule working smoothly and making certain that our shop fulfilled its purpose, the support of our mission work." Laying it on a little thick there, Rev? After all, Benny had allowed embezzlement to go on right under his nose, and he had been breaking his marriage vows by cruising around dating websites. But I kept my expression neutral and watched the crowd. A couple of people shuffled their feet and several gazes dropped to the ground. I made mental notes. "The deacons and I have interviewed several managerial prospects, and we're in agreement that someone who has already put in time as a volunteer will have the best background for the job and will make the transition easiest for all. So, without further ado, I'm happy to announce that our new manager is Nancy Pomeroy." Only a fool wouldn't have guessed the choice. Nancy had been standing at Marshall's side, waiting for this very moment. She smiled and gave a little wave when light applause broke out. He offered to relinquish his spot on the makeshift dais, but she declined.
"All I want to say is that the office door will always be open. Come to me with any concerns at all. Thanks."
Since the entire meeting hadn't taken even half of the allotted time, everyone in the crowd milled around, and I saw the perfect chance for the bombshell. I nudged Dottie, and she launched into our little prearranged drama.
"Murder? Serious? The cops?"
Her voice carried well enough that more than a dozen people easily heard.
"Yeah, there's a video showing the killer as they delivered a little box to Benny's desk."
I dropped my voice, because if there's one thing that will grab people's attention more than a shout, it's a whisper. 2 people stepped nearer, the better to catch every nuance.
"You know, there was also some money missing,"
I continued.
"So they asked me to set up a little hidden camera to find out what was going on.
Who knew it would also show that a bee was purposely let loose at Benny's desk?"
I was shocked when I saw it, and I'll tell you, the police are super interested. I'm taking the video to them today."
If that didn't get the killer to follow me, I don't know what would. Only problem was, it's a lie. As much as I'd stared at every frame of the video in a supreme touch of irony, Benny himself had spotted the camera and grabbed it away before the box was brought in. No matter. It's not what you actually know, it's what they think you know. All I needed was a reaction. Someone would come after that camera as soon as the rumor spread far enough. I let Dottie and Elsa go to their jobs, and I stepped over to congratulate Nancy.
"I did a little cleaning in the office the other day,"
I said, maybe a little too loudly.
"but I haven't yet had time to clear Benny's personal browser history from the computer at your desk. I should do that so you can start fresh."
She didn't seem to care, which I took as an invitation to go ahead. The bait had been dangled. The trap was set. Now I just needed to stay vigilant and wait for the killer to show up. Chapter 51. Whispers passed among the workers, and each group I passed turned and got really busy as I walked by. I shifted my eyes left and right, watching for the person who would be sending deadly vibes my way. I didn't spot any, but the day was young. I went into the office and left the door standing open as I took a seat behind Benny's desk. While the computer booted up, I set up the nanny cam to face the desk and my phone to record conversation. All I had to do was tap one button the moment someone walked into the room. As a precaution, I'd tucked my pistol into my purse this morning at home. Now I set it beside my right leg, tucked into the crevice between the chair seat and the arm. I'm licensed to carry it, but I knew it would be a last-second resort. With a camera on me, I would only pull the gun if my life was imminently in danger and there was no choice. Out in the sales area, I could tell the store had opened for business. Voices blended, and I heard Elsa speaking to a customer. I fully intended to do what I'd told Nancy, to clear Benny's browser history. I looked again at the list of sites he'd recently visited and came back to that dating site, Find a Match. I hadn't logged out of Benny's account, and it came up without need for a password this time. A red banner appeared now across the top with words in white. Are you sure? Sure of what? The next smaller print said, You've previously selected this person for a date. Are you sure you want to delete their profile from your matches? I clicked no and watched the banner curl up and go away. The face behind the banner was one I recognized. I was just beginning to process the surprise when I sensed motion and looked up. Eugene, what can I do for you? I picked up a pen and tried my best to look nonchalant, while my heart was beating a zillion times a second.
I think you know, Charlie.
His eyes were wild, his movements nervous and jerky. I sneaked my left hand over to tap the record button on my phone.
You've put it together about Benny and me, haven't you? How we found each other and fell in love?
Afraid my face couldn't hide my response to that. After all, I'd only spotted Eugene's photo about 30 seconds ago. He was about to delete your profile from his contacts. What happened?
He broke my heart. That's what happened.
So you were dating?
Benny got nervous after a few dates, afraid his wife would figure it out, and she probably would have. Bonnie looks like this sweet little churchy housewife, but she's pretty sharp.
Did Bonnie figure it out? All at once, she might be back on my suspect list. Eugene gave a laugh that was more like a quick bark.
Ha! Not exactly.
He paced to the other end of the room, realizing our voices might carry, and closed the office door. I really hoped the little hidden camera was catching all this, but I had no way of knowing.
It was Benny's idea to break it off with me, and he did it in the worst.
His voice cracked. He swallowed hard and started over.
The worst way possible. In a public place. A restaurant. I was devastated.
Benny was really grumpy around the office last week. Was that when it happened? Eugene hung his head, nodding.
I threw a fit when he told me. I just threw my drink in his face and stormed out.
Oh, that had to be rough for both of them.
And then he just couldn't come around. I tried to make up, tried to win him back. That was the day he chewed me out here in the store, in front of other people.
Which I sensed was the last straw. A picture came into my head and everything clicked into place. Eugene's mother's house down in the valley. She had an orchard, apples, and there were beehives. Tears had begun to run down Eugene's face.
I was just so angry over the humiliation. All I could think of was payback.
I sat very, very still. This could go any direction.
I just caught a couple of the bees in a little box Mom had sitting around the house. Brought them here.
His eyes held that wild, unpredictable look.
I swear, I didn't want him to die. I'd seen his EpiPen, and he said he was allergic to bee venom, but I had no idea it was that severe. I thought he'd only swell up a little bit, and then he'd be sorry for breaking up, especially when I rushed in with the pen in my hand and saved the day. Then he'd love me again.
So you took the pen from his desk? He nodded, his face a red and miserable mess now.
I put it in my pocket. I was right out in the next room, so when the shaken up bees were let loose, I'd know it, and I could get right to him. I thought there would be plenty of time. I didn't want him to die.
One of those bees must have flown away. The other did the dirty deed. Oh, Eugene, I'm so sorry that your romance didn't turn out as you wanted. But you can't play around with this kind of thing. I was referring to all of it. Messing around with a married man, underestimating the severity of the sting, removing the medical device that Benny had been reaching for in his final moments. Eugene dropped to the floor sobbing, while I turned off the recording and the camera. I called the police. It didn't feel like much of a victory, but I had a confession. Chapter 52. Once the police had taken Eugene into custody, I felt at loose ends. One case solved, the other in the hands of the police and Reverend Marshall. I left the thrift shop and spent the afternoon at my desk at RJP Investigations, mainly so I wouldn't wander the house aimlessly, popping brownie bites and Milky Ways. I found myself checking the news obsessively, mainly because Drake was away and in a dangerous place. In some ways, I began to wish I'd gone along with him. I still could. I went online and checked flights, then talked myself out of it. He'd be airborne all day and would be exhausted at night. We talked a few minutes that evening and the next. The Forest Service had ordered way more aircraft than needed, and he worried they were just getting in each other's way. But until he was released from the job, he could only do his best to help, and at least the pay was good. I went to bed early and read a Ben Pecos mystery. Loved it. Started and devoured another one. 3 days into the routine, I was practically clawing the walls. I needed to be busy, but even Ron and Victoria had other plans when I called. I don't handle boredom well, and the TV was now on nearly all day. And so it was that I caught a familiar name. Police are saying the couple, who apparently came to Albuquerque only 6 or 7 months ago, managed to gain the trust of the board of directors at the Theater Guild. That trust was, sadly, misplaced. The couple, identified as Rodney and Carol Day, attended a number of gala fundraisers and became deeply involved in the raising of money for refurbishment of the theater's venue. My ears perked up and I stared at the screen as the male co-anchor took over. In a scheme where the supposedly wealthy couple would match incoming donations up to $1 million, they have now apparently absconded with all the donation money. Theater Guild board members have filed a complaint with the police, but have been unavailable for comment to Channel 7. Police say the couple have been known to use various aliases. An all-points bulletin has been issued for the day's vehicle, and we understand it was spotted 2 days ago north of Denver. More on this breaking news story as we have it. Wow. This made the tens of thousands taken from the thrift shop look like peanuts. I pictured what I'd seen in the day's rental house. The classy lifestyle and the formal clothing left behind. It made sense that Carol and Rodney were setting themselves up to fit into that social set. I shook my head, still having a hard time picturing frumpy Carol from Heavenly Treasures being able to transform herself into the tall, slender woman in a beaded gown. But it was increasingly obvious now that was exactly what she'd done. Then it hit me. Did the police realize this was the same woman involved in the case I'd turned over to them? Had they yet made the connection between the glamour couple and the thrift shop thefts? I called the number from the bottom of the news screen and was connected to a Sergeant Rodriguez in Major Crimes. He hadn't a clue who I was, and only vaguely recollected having received a box of evidence from Detective Gary Broadman. I felt frustration well up inside me. The Days are driving a pink Cadillac. I know it's the same couple. The color and make of the car weren't announced on the news, he said. I know. The news said only that there's an APB out on it, and that they've already left New Mexico. I've seen that car, I tell you, and it was being driven by this couple. Rodriguez took my name and number and basically left it with a don't call us, we'll call you attitude. Well, this man doesn't know me. I immediately called Gary Broadman and repeated my conviction that these 2 crimes were committed by the same couple. At least this cop was sympathetic.
None of this is in my hands, Charlie. But hold on a minute.
Before I could respond, he put me on hold, but at least it wasn't the brush-off. Yet. When he came back, he assured me he'd passed along the information to someone in major crimes.
I don't know if it will make much difference. So far, it seems the runaway Cadillac has only been tracked by local and state law enforcement in each jurisdiction. At some point, the FBI will most likely be called in, but there are channels, and I'm out of the loop.
So the car has been spotted in multiple places? You said each jurisdiction?
Colorado and Wyoming. And there was one in Billings, Montana, who swore he'd seen it. This is part of the reason we don't put the vehicle description out over the news. Everybody and their dog will start seeing pink Cadillacs everywhere, and it will become too many to follow up on.
I understand. These reports have come from law enforcement?
Right.
He thanked me for the tip, and I thanked him for listening to me. But he was unwilling or unable to share much more about the progress of the case. I got the impression that APD's involvement was minimal at this point, and if state cops in other places could pinpoint the couple's location, the FBI might step in for an arrest. I thought back to the articles I'd read. Under various aliases, the Days had been suspected in a bunch of financial crimes all over the country. They'd even been questioned a few times, but they always managed to slip away to avoid conviction. Now more than $1 million was involved, and they were about to pull their same old tricks and get away with it. Call it righteous indignation or plain old outrage, but something welled up inside me. I could not let this happen. I was pondering my next step when my phone rang and I saw it was Drake.
Hey, guess what? I've been released from the fire job. I can head south this afternoon.
Click went an idea in my head. Can you hang around another day or so? I might just want to join you. Bless my dear husband, he didn't ask for details. I told him I'd see what I could put together and would call him back. Detective Broadman had mentioned Billings, Montana, so that's where I started. Billings isn't a small town, but it's not a huge city either. I only had to wait on hold through 2 transfers before I got an officer on the line who said he'd spotted the 1959 Eldorado. I gave him the bare minimum of reasons for my interest in the couple driving the vehicle.
I stared at it for a minute because my granny used to have one like it, a blue one,
he said. Do you think the car is still somewhere in Billings?
Doubt it. This was yesterday, early in the day, before we heard anything about the APB. And it was headed out of town then.
Which direction?
West on I-90, toward Bozeman.
I thanked him and we exchanged names and numbers. Told him I'd appreciate a call if anyone else reported seeing the car. Call it an instinct or a hunch. I had an idea there was a slim chance we could catch the thieves if we acted quickly. I called Drake back and outlined my plan. An hour later, I dropped off Freckles with Elsa, and I was on my way to the airport. Chapter 53. By the time I reached the ticket counter at the airport, I'd had 2 calls from my contact in the Billings Police Department.
They're heading north,
he reported the first time.
The car was spotted at a gas station in Helena. That pretty much rules out they're heading directly for Idaho, Washington, or Oregon.
I'm heading that way. Where should I fly into?
They keep heading the same way. Great Falls would be your best bet.
Keep me posted. The ticket agent was waiting. I bought my ticket for the next flight out and barely had time to make it to the gate. I took my seat and texted Drake my arrival details. He was waiting in the passenger greeting area when I came rolling out with my carry-on bag, and we shared some heartfelt hugs and kisses, appropriate to the days and nights we'd been apart.
Our ship is in the general aviation section,
he said, taking the handle of my bag.
We can get a ride out front, then you let me know where we're going next.
I texted the officer in Billings, the one I was starting to think of as a buddy. Any more pink caddy sightings?
Great Falls, 4 hours ago. Nothing since.
Drake flagged down a cab. I pondered what the news about the Cadillac meant. It was getting dark, so the couple were possibly settling in to spend the night here. I texted back my friend and asked if he could get the local police here to do drive-thrus of the hotel and motel parking lots. I had no idea if that was a simple request or a huge job, but he responded right back, "Sure." The ride to the general aviation area of the international airport was a quick one, and I spotted our familiar jet ranger tied down outside a large hangar.
"So, what's next?"
Drake asked as he unloaded my bag. I wasn't sure.
"Dinner? I get the feeling you haven't eaten anything all day."
Not true. I had a nutritious bag of pretzels on the plane.
"We're getting you some real food."
He got the cabbie's attention again and asked where was the nearest steakhouse. I supposed it wouldn't hurt to slow down and eat something. We had half the area's cops looking out for the pink car, and we had the quickest means of transportation waiting to catch up with them once we found it. For once, I wouldn't mind showing off a little, landing the helicopter in a motel parking lot to prevent the days from driving away, if that's what it took. I was halfway through my ribeye when my phone began pinging with text messages.
"No luck on the car at the motels, but..."
"But what?" Next message.
"Sorry, a sharp officer spotted one on the lot at a used car place."
What? Same car?
"Not sure. They're checking it out."
I couldn't swallow another bite, so Drake insisted on having the rest of my meal boxed up to go. 5 minutes later, another message.
"Must be the right car. New Mexico plates."
"Where? Address, please." The information came through a minute later, along with the name of the officer on the scene, Harry Strum. I looked up the address and found that it was closer to the car lot than going back to the airport, so we called our taxi guy back and he promised to come right away. We were probably going to wish we'd rented a car, what with all these taxi charges. Harry Strum's police cruiser sat crosswise at the entry to A1 Rides, used cars with style.
"I called the car lot owner,"
Strum said after we'd introduced ourselves.
"He says he's got no pink Cadillac on the lot. He's coming right down."
If the lot had no record of the car, what was it doing here?
"This that vehicle that's got the multi-state APB out on it? Guess there was a lot of sightings of it,"
Strum said, looking a bit proud that he was the one who'd spotted it. The owner of the business arrived just then, pulling in behind Strum's cruiser in a late-model Mercedes. He introduced himself as Rex Chance, and he seemed genuinely surprised to see the caddy sitting in the second row.
"Never saw it before in my life,"
he said.
"I swear this car was not here when I closed the office at 6 o'clock.
That was only an hour ago, so it made sense the days were still in the area. I had an idea. "Can you check the whole lot and tell me what's missing?"
"Huh?"
"If they abandoned their car here, it makes sense that they took another one in its place. If you can tell us the make and model of the missing one, it's that much quicker we can catch them." But there wasn't an empty spot on the lot, and the area around the office and garages didn't seem to be missing anything either.
"Darndest thing,"
Rex Chance said.
"This baby's pristine. Gotta be worth over 200 grand. Why would somebody leave it?"
The figure stunned me, but I knew exactly why they'd left it behind. The beloved car had become a liability, and their only hope for escape was to be in something far less ostentatious. I looked up and down the street, which was still fairly busy after hours. In the few blocks I could see, there were 3 more car lots. I knew what they'd done. "Can we get the other lots checked, too?" I asked Officer Strum. "They've taken a car from one of them. I'm certain of it." He hemmed and hawed for a moment until Chance offered to help.
"I know the competition. I'll give them a call."
It took another hour and a half, during which I paced and chafed at the delay. But eventually we learned that a red Jeep Wagoneer with vintage wood-grain side paneling was missing from Joe's Best Deals, a lot 2 blocks west on the same street. Bless them, Rodney and Carol couldn't resist driving a distinctive vehicle. "I suppose it would be too much to ask all of your officers to make another run through the motel parking lots?" Strom didn't look hopeful, but he put the call into his chief. The answer came back. No way. There'd been a big bar fight on the south end of town and a traffic pileup on I-15. Pretty much everyone was needed. Drake and I talked it over.
In the morning we can take off and watch from the air. No one will think twice about a helicopter. All the news stations usually have one to report traffic situations.
Strom cleared his throat.
Tomorrow's supposed to be my day off, but, well, I'd love to see how this thing plays out. It'd be smart to have law enforcement along,
Drake pointed out to me.
You can't arrest these people yourself.
And so the plan was set. We'd meet at daylight. Strom graciously took us out to the hangar to get some overnight things. He then dropped us off at the nearest of the airport hotels. Chapter 54. I didn't think I'd sleep at all, anticipating tomorrow's showdown, but the exhaustion set in and must have told my body otherwise. We'd set alarms for 4 a.m., and I was out cold until the sound brought me back to life. A quick shower, tucking everything back into my carry-on bag, and a slug of coffee from the little machine in the room, I was ready as the sky began to lighten up a bit after 6. Officer Strom must have been even more excited than we were. He was waiting in the lobby when we appeared, and we teased him about whether he'd slept there. He didn't actually deny it, but he was in civilian clothes today. Levi's, a plaid shirt, sheepskin jacket, and felt Stetson. He carried his service pistol and a badge. We arrived at the hangar, where Drake proceeded with his regular pre-flight inspection. Strom and I chatted and helped ourselves to a couple of the FBO's donuts.
Good thing we have your helicopter, he said. There are several roads leading out of Great Falls, going all directions. Our chief here is a cooperative guy, but I couldn't see him stationing officers at every possible intersection where this vehicle might attempt their getaway. He'd want any of us ready to take a traffic call or stop a speeder.
Perfectly understandable. It's not really your problem, the fact that this couple stole a bunch of money in New Mexico.
I paused.
Or do I have to say they allegedly stole it?
He chuckled. I know it's PC and it's what we have to officially say, but I trust you when you say you've got all the evidence to prove it.
I held out both hands, fingers spread. That's up to the Albuquerque PD. But if we can help get these people expedited, it could well be the end of a very long crime spree. Drake gave the go-ahead and we climbed aboard. 10 minutes later, we were circling the city, with emphasis on the area Strom pointed out, where I-15 and Highway 89 and 87 converged near each other. At first, the vehicles below looked like nothing more than a mass of crawling shapes, like ants milling about the central hub of an anthill. But soon I began to pick out details as the light got better. I was able to see colors more distinctly. The Jeep we were looking for was actually a maroon shade, and boxy vehicles in that color were not too common. Drake spotted it first.
Look there, on the interstate, our 3 o'clock,
he said, pointing over his right shoulder. He turned the aircraft so we were facing the same direction as the strip of highway.
I need to stay above and behind them so they don't notice us.
Can we verify it's the right vehicle? I asked. It would be pretty embarrassing to corner this one, only to find out there were dozens of these older Jeeps on the road.
Binoculars, under the back seat.
Strom reached around and found them, taking them from the case and aiming them in the right direction.
Don't stare through the lenses too long, Drake cautioned. You'll get queasy.
The officer took his advice, looking ahead and then away.
What's the tag number that car lot guy gave us?
I read it off the note I'd made.
It's them.
He looked away from the binoculars.
And that town ahead, that's Shelby, and the only thing farther out is Sweetgrass. They're heading for the Canadian border.
Drake let loose with a curse.
That can't happen.
I gulped and turned to face the officer in the back seat. He's right. We can't simply fly across an international border. There are procedures and forms and everything. Drake adjusted his flight speed.
Sturm, I need you to call out the reinforcements. Tell the state police and any local departments where we are and what we're chasing. Let them know the suspects are now an international flight risk.
Drake backed away slightly. Without backup, we had to be careful how we dealt with this. The highway was a busy one, and unlike the movies, a helicopter doesn't necessarily have great odds of forcing a speeding vehicle. We might intimidate them into stopping, but if they were armed, they could do a lot of damage to us.
At this point, I'd suggest we let them get through the town, Strum said. There's an intersection, and we'll know whether they'll make a turn. And after that, it's a straight shot to the border. It'd be the place to set up roadblocks if we need to.
His phone vibrated and he picked it up.
Yeah? Okay, good.
When he set the phone back down, he leaned toward Drake.
Border Patrol and State Police have been alerted. We'll have all the backup we need.
We watched ahead as the Jeep sped on through Shelby and stayed the course northbound. From our vantage point, we could see the border station ahead.
Okay, folks, it's time,
Drake said, his eyes on the traffic and our target. He gave the throttle an extra burst and brought our altitude down to 100 feet, just above power line height.
I hope those officers show up. We're running out of territory real soon.
I looked ahead and behind, but didn't see a law enforcement vehicle in sight. Chapter 55. We were practically on top of the Jeep, Drake matching the helicopter's speed to theirs, when the occupants became aware of us. The Jeep swerved slightly, then righted its course. I had one moment's flash of a thought that if we had misjudged the whole situation, and this car wasn't the day's getaway vehicle, we would have some real explaining to do.
You got a bullhorn in here? Strum asked. Better, a good PA system.
Drake's hands were busy maintaining control, but he tilted his head toward the microphone mounted to the cockpit instrument panel. I lifted the mic and stretched the cord out to hand it over to Strum. He keyed the button.
You and the Jeep Wagoneer, pull over and stop your vehicle.
The Jeep sped up.
City, state, and federal law enforcement have you in sight. Stop the vehicle now.
I thought he sounded full of authority, but these folks were either incredibly brave or really, really stupid. Drake eased the helicopter to the right side of the Jeep and brought her down to 60 feet. There was no way the car's occupants weren't aware of who was following and how close we were. A peek over my shoulder revealed a string of cruisers coming up behind with lights flashing. All the other traffic had slowed way down or pulled off the road. Ahead, the border crossing was no more than a couple miles away. I don't know if this pair thought they could drive straight through the border crossing and somehow get away. They weren't Butch and Sundance, and things don't work that way anymore.
Can we get in front of them?
Strum asked, his voice high with tension.
We can do that.
Drake sped up a little. Now directly over the highway, he matched the Jeep's speed and turned the aircraft so we were at a 45-degree angle to the vehicle, staring straight into their windshield. It was definitely Rodney and Carol. She was at the wheel and looked ready to brazen her way through. Rodney reached across and gripped the steering wheel, shouting something at his wife first. For an incredibly long second, I thought she would resist, but then the Jeep slowed. It shimmied when she hit the brakes, and then it swerved to a stop in the center of the highway. The helicopter hovered in front of the now sideways Jeep until the state police cars caught up. Then Drake landed on the road 30 feet away. Strum and I unbuckled and hopped out. I had no idea whether the fugitive pair were armed, but they had no real options when 6 uniformed officers took a stance with guns aimed at them. They emerged from the Jeep with their hands in the air. The cops holstered their pistols. Rodney Day defaulted to what was apparently his old modus operandi, pouring on the charm, trying to wheedle the officers into believing it was all a simple misunderstanding, that they had no idea they'd been driving a little too fast. "That's not going to cut it," I said. "We've tracked you all the way from Albuquerque." The woman looked at me as one of the state cops took her wrists and cuffed them. "Charlie Parker, I knew you were trouble." Her perfect posture and elegant bearing were gone. Aside from the short, stylish haircut, I could now see Carol Meyerson and the woman whose face sagged and shoulders slumped as the officer recited her rights. She looked much older than her 65 years now. Gone was the elegant woman driving a classic pink Cadillac. Rodney straightened his jacket and tugged his tie into place. Gentlemanly, even when his world was coming to an end. He wanted to look his best for his mugshot photo, I supposed. Strum led the way to the back of the Jeep, slipping on latex gloves he'd pulled from a back pocket. When he unzipped each of the suitcases and lifted the layers of clothing, there were bundles of cash, lots of it.
"What's this?"
he asked, pulling a long metal tube from among Rodney's possessions. The suspects were now being led to Montana State Police vehicles, but Rodney was keeping an eye on our actions.
"My Picasso!"
he cried out. But by the time Strum had pulled the end cap off the tube and slipped the painting out, Mr. Day had nothing to say about it from his seat in the back of a cruiser. Chapter 56. A few weeks have passed since all that drama unfolded, and I've been happy enough to settle back into my normal days and wait for the holiday season, which will be here before we know it. Eugene Towner's confession, in the hands of a sharp attorney, might have been thrown out, and he could have pleaded for sympathy with a jury. He would have had mine. The poor man was a broken soul, and I felt terrible as I handed over the camera and the recording to Kent Taylor. But Eugene didn't go that route. His mother sort of pitched a fit, but he felt the weight of his actions and stood before the judge, ready to accept whatever was imposed. The judge seemed like a fair man, one who believed that even though Benny's death in itself had been accidental, the premeditation that went into Eugene's carrying the bee into the office and removing the EpiPen warranted a punishment. So the ex-deacon who'd fallen for a married man was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to 5 years. Elsa, Dottie, and I had attended the hearing, and we watched Eugene walk off, cuffed and accompanied by a bailiff, his head hung low and tears running down his face. His mother looked shell-shocked, and I felt sorry for her. Bonnie Stevens still seemed stunned by everything that had happened. The church celebrated a much better victory in the case of the missing money. There was a quick extradition of Rodney and Carol Day from Montana. The couple refused to confess to anything, including how a Picasso missing from a New York art gallery for more than 25 years ended up in their possession. So there will be a trial, most likely a lengthy one. I've already been informed that I will have to testify and explain how I came up with the figures for the money taken from the thrift shop. The footage from my little hidden camera will play a major part in the prosecution, so it seems that money was well spent. Even if it takes a while, it looks like the church will get its money back. Elsa is everyone's hero right now. She was awarded Volunteer of the Month at the shop, and Reverend Miller made a big deal of her ethical and quick-witted actions. We're all very proud. In preparation for my own court testimony, the forensic accounting team in the district attorney's office have already let me know that they easily tracked the transfers of money from the Theater Guild's fundraiser accounts that Carol did with her smartphone. She might have been sharp, but she wasn't that sharp. When I asked how the attorneys envisioned the couple would present a defense, they suggested that most likely the two will show up in court, dressed down and making the jury believe they're just two helpless old folks who couldn't have possibly masterminded anything so elaborate. I could believe it, having seen the amazing transformation Carol had done from elegant socialite to frumpy office worker. Unfortunately, as the cops interviewed dozens of people who were part of the theater crowd, no photos seemed to exist of Carol or Rodney Day. The pair were like ghosts when it came to facing the camera lens, so proving their chameleon-like abilities to a jury could prove tricky. I imagined that was exactly why they'd been suspected so often in the past, but never convicted. Yes, I'd say the law had its work cut out for it with this case. Meanwhile, Drake and I have settled into our home routine. We're getting together with Ron and Victoria tonight for dinner, and to hear all about Jason's experience at a wilderness survival camp his class went to. It sounds like my teenage nephew is coming around, and we're all hoping and praying he'll stay on the right side of the law. He'll be home at Thanksgiving in just a few weeks. I think we'll all have much to be thankful for this year. This concludes Money Can Be Murder by Connie Shelton. This novel is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either the product of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to the actual events, locales, or persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental. If you would like to receive our online newsletter listing new releases, simply go to booksinmotion.com and register with your email address. Newsletter members receive special discounts and freebies. No purchase necessary. That's one word, booksinmotion.com. From Books in Motion, this is Rebecca Cook. Thanks for listening.